Hi, I'm Ahmed Shabuddin, filling in for Femi Oke, and you're in the stream. Today, murdered while on the job. Why are so few killers of journalists brought to justice? Our digital producer, Malika Bilal, is with us as always, looking out for your live feedback. Malika, I know that we've been hearing from a lot of journalists, a lot of activists. What's something that stood out?
They're sharing their stories with us, and I'm going to share some of those stories during today's show. But I want to first play this video comment we got from someone. She's a journalist, and she had some pretty strong words. So have a listen to this.
Why should we care about the killing of journalists? Because every time a journalist is killed, there is one less voice to guarantee our access to information. And access to information is a human right. And access to information empowers communities to participate in the democratic process.
One less voice. That's what Sylvia had to say. We want to hear from you as well. So tweet us with the hashtag AJStream.
And joining us on set is Miroslava Gongadze. She is a journalist and activist based here in Washington. Her husband, also a journalist, was murdered in Ukraine in 2000, and she's been fighting ever since to bring those responsible to justice. Welcome to the stream.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Journalists being threatened, beaten, and killed is now an epidemic. Since 1992, more than 700 men and women have been murdered because of their profession. That's according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. But in only a handful of those cases are the masterminds ever captured or prosecuted. Here's a breakdown by the committee. In the hopes of urging member states to do more, the United Nations General Assembly declared November 2nd the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. So what steps must governments take to guarantee that the perpetrators of these crimes are brought to justice? Joining us via Skype to discuss this is Courtney Raj, Advocacy Director with the Committee to Protect Journalists. And in Iligan City, Philippines, is Jesus Dureza. He's the chairman and president of the Philippines Press Institute. He's also the president of the Mindanao Times. Welcome to the stream, everyone. Miroslava, I want to start by asking you a very basic question. I know impunity for you is a very personal issue. Why is that?
When your loved ones are killed because of their job, it becomes a personal issue. So it happened to me in 2000, and since then this has become a part of my life to fight for justice. And fortunately, you said only handful of cases when the mastermind of the crimes are brought to justice. I would say single cases. I probably can give my example. In my case, all 4 perpetrators of the crime against my husband was brought to justice, but instigators is still enjoying their freedom.
And Miroslava, we have a photo of your husband here. For 14 years you've been, speaking out about this. And you said, and I want to kind of quote you, you said after he was murdered that silence would not save you. Impunity, as you may know, thrives on silence. So what will save you and others who are also in your situation?
Speaking out and working and pushing and not giving up to find truth and find justice. When my husband was first, he just didn't came home from work basically, and we didn't know what to do. I realized that I have to find him first And then when his body was discovered, I realized that I promised to myself, and I promised to everyone, I said I would do whatever in my power to find justice, because otherwise we need to have examples of justice. Otherwise this impunity issue would go on again.
And I know people have been jailed. I mean, do you feel as though you've gotten justice?
I got partial justice, but I'm still fighting. 14 years after his murder, I'm still fighting, and I'm still trying to bring to justice the instigators. And president of the country, former president of the country, is among them.
And hopefully we can discuss that a little bit later. Jess, with that in mind, I know that you're doing that very same work, trying to bring people to justice. And I have to ask you, according to CPJ's latest report, that's the Committee to Protect Journalists, the Philippines is one of the worst offenders when it comes to impunity. If you look at this list, this is the breakdown. Iraq at the top, Philippines with 67. This is the top 20 countries. These are cases of complete impunity. As a journalist, I know you faced threats for your own life. As a lawyer, you've represented journalists who've been threatened. You've had to take matters into your own hands. Why is that, Jess?
Well, first of all, we got a wholesale killing of more than 30 journalists in one incident in the so-called Maguindanao massacre. As a matter of fact, let me tell you that there's a lot of anger in the hearts not only of the relatives but amongst members of media in the Philippines, and they're even now gathering together because we're facing the another year of an anniversary of the biggest killing of journalists in the Maguindanao massacre. And the environment, especially in many areas in Mindanao, that is afflicted with some sort of conflict in these areas. And of course, the fact that the justice system is not really a quick mechanism for redress. People try to take the law into their own hands, and then if law enforcement is not that effective, then we see impunity. We see a lot of incidents happening, taking the law into their own hands, and not resorting to the usual normal forces of seeking redress through our justice system. Unfortunately, many of these areas are still suffering with this kind of a problem. And journalists even have to protect themselves,
Right.
Against
And if I
all
could
this
just-
threat.
Yeah, go ahead, Courtney.
Well, I would just add to that I think the Philippines exemplifies the problems with trying to get justice in the killings of murdered journalists. First of all, there's a lack of political will to really follow through on pursuing justice in many cases. And then even if there is political will, they often lack the capacity, the institutional capacity, the investigatory capacity, judicial system to really pursue justice. And we know that in 90% of the murders of journalists, no one is ever prosecuted.
Right.
And in only 2% of cases is there ever full justice pursued. It's just a travesty, and it has broad implications for society broadly because their access to information is restricted. And many of the journalists are covering corruption or how their tax dollars or their aid assistance is being used. And then the public will never know.
Courtney, you said this has broad implications for society, and so I just want to give our viewers a taste of how broad that really is. We're hearing from journalists from all over the world describing to us some of the threats that they have faced in their own work. So this is a tweet we received from Dublin. Craig says he was warned, be careful what you write. You'd be an easy man to find. Miroslava, we also got this tweet. This is from the Maldives, and she writes in, journalists in the Maldives routinely receive death threats via mass SMS. 84% of journalists have received death threats at least once. So in the course of you trying to find justice for your husband, Miroslava, have you received threats?
I didn't receive threats, but I was followed. My phone was tapped. I was afraid for my life. I put my kids in a small town outside of Kyiv, so I protect myself as much as I could. I couldn't walk around the town by myself. I'm still, 14 years after, I'm still in Ukraine, feel like just turning my head all the time because I feel that I'm not safe. So that's actually affected me a lot, and that's why, and in the end of the day, I just left the country.
And you know, when you talk about not feeling safe, I'm curious, Jess, you were holding or armed and you used a handgun when you were a journalist. I know that you're involved in training journalists to shoot a gun as well. Why was that necessary for you?
Well, in some areas here, when you are threatened as a journalist, in order for you to still continue freely writing and be free from fear, you must feel confident yourself that you can contend with any situation at the proper time. Like, for example, I'll tell you now, in one area in the south of Mindanao, just last week, a group of journalists went on a shooting competition, training of handguns, how to shoot in a range. And that is for the purpose really of protecting themselves because of the hostile environment where they operate. And the only way for you to really write freely is you must have to feel confident that you can contend with any threat. In my case, when I was a journalist, but this was during martial law in the Philippines, martial was declared in 1972 and it was lifted in 1987. And I was an active journalist at the time. I had to arm myself with a gun, because at that time I was writing critically about military abuse and also abuse the communist rebels on the ground.
So just
the only way for you to feel free and be able to write is to be able to protect yourself if something happens.
So with that in mind, I mean, would you categorize the Philippines as a country with a free press?
Oh yes, we are the swingest free press in this part of the world. As a matter of fact, we are considered the freest press, but there are incidents of liquidation, killings, not only, however, of journalists, but the public as a whole. You know, there are hit squads. There are people called riding in tandem in motorcycles that can hit you and just eliminate you.
Courtney, you were going to jump. You were going. Forgive me, Courtney. You were going to jump in. Go ahead.
Well, I think that they raised a couple of important points, which is that many journalists receive threats before they're murdered. We know that this year, of the 40 journalists that have been killed, 29% received threats before they were killed. So it is important that journalists take those threats seriously. And we also know that government officials or political actors were responsible for 86% of the murders this year. So it is incumbent upon the governments to take action. Obviously, there are some cases of murders by non-state actors, for example, that are much more difficult for the government or the state to pursue. Such
as ISIL and whatnot?
Exactly, right. It's very difficult to think about how they're going to bring those killers to justice. But we know that when the masterminds are in political operatives, as they were in the case of Gordaj's husband, or in the case of so many murders around the world, that those people can be brought to justice, and it's the responsibility of the state to do so.
Right.
The issue is that, yes, it's the responsibility of the state, but how can you expect the state officials who actually ordered the crime to investigate themselves? There's no way they would do that. And I faced that. You want to ask?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, so what would you imagine is the authority that could put pressure on any government, whether it's Ukraine or any other, to actually bring about justice?
We actually talked with Courtney before the show, and I do think that there is international mechanism of investigative crimes against journalists are needed. I'm talking about it for a long time, and what I did in my case, I realized that I cannot use internal system because there's no way they would pursue justice and bring people to court. So I went to international court. I went to European Court for Human Rights, and thankfully and happily for me that Ukraine is the part of the European Council of Europe. So I won the case in European Court for Human Rights, and I organized a special investigative. The European Council of Europe appointed a rapporteur specifically on my case, and that rapporteur for a long time, for 8 years, was responsible of writing reports on the progress of the investigation.
Right.
So, and this as well, I tried to involve, and I did FBI, and FBI did all the DNA expertise. So I organized everyone in the world to push that.
Right.
So.
We have an opportunity.
Courtney, I want to jump in here because, in talking about this, one of the things that seems to come up online among people that are tweeting us is what is a journalist and who are we really talking about when we talk about impunity for journalists? I'd like you to have a listen to this video comment. This was sent to the stream from UNESCO. Have a listen.
Increasingly, attacks on journalists doesn't just affect traditional journalists. More and more attacks are targeted at citizen journalists, or what we call social media producer of news. That could be you. Just last week, the Director General of UNESCO condemned the killing of citizen journalist Mario Rubio, who was killed for reporting on criminals' activities using Twitter. This is unacceptable. Everyone must be able to report safely and freely. Are you free and safe to report as a citizen journalist?
So Courtney, in your research, are people free as citizen journalists, and what really makes them a journalist? Is there a line there?
So I think the key is that we look at the act of journalism rather than whether that person is paid for, or accredited by a news organization. And Ming is exactly right in saying that the increase in citizen journalists and journalists who are not necessarily employed by a news organization has increased. Oftentimes, those people don't necessarily have the same training or the same expectation of safety that maybe a professional journalist does. And I think that as we see that the means of journalism and the mechanisms for producing journalism have expanded, so have the threats. And that's why we see that the past 2 years have been the deadliest on record for journalists. We know that Syria is incredibly dangerous, and that social media producers, as Ming called them, which we consider journalists when they're producing news and information, are increasingly among those killed.
Courtney, he also referenced UNESCO, as you must have heard, and I know that you used to work with UNESCO, and I want to ask you, there are critics who say that this day of impunity is really just kind of a PR thing. For example, in the lack of any real authority to pressure governments, if governments are in fact allegedly involved in the cover-up or murder of journalists, it seems somewhat discouraging, at least on the face of it to me. For example, UNESCO had requested each member state to submit a status of judicial inquiries of murdered journalists. And it was sad that less than half of the member states reported any outstanding cases, fewer than half even replied. Is this discouraging to you, and what can be actually done?
So I think it's encouraging that there is recognition at the international level that this crime cannot go without a major attention being focused on it. And so that's what a day like the International Day to End Impunity recognizes. It marshals the attention of the international community and of states, and it's the first step in holding them accountable. But I completely agree. In fact, I wrote the chapters on safety for UNESCO's World Trends in Freedom of Expression and Media Development report, which looked at the responses or lack thereof by states. Many states have several outstanding responses, and this is a voluntary request for information. There's no reason that the government can't provide that information to UNESCO. But the problem is that the UN lacks teeth. So
Courtney,
you have. Well, I think it's important to note
Finish your
that
point.
governments have signed on to this resolution and are getting the PR points, as you note, and yet they have been among the ones who have not provided information. And so I think we have to hold them to not allow them to get away with that double standard.
So Courtney, with that in mind, what would help? Would one or two high-profile convictions actually help? Yes, Miroslava?
Yes, I do. I do think because if the people who are involved in the crime or instigators, perpetrators, or whatever, see that someone else are held responsible for the crime, they would be more reluctant to do the same. So because they would be afraid to get to prison. So I think a couple of cases, successful cases, will help actually. Yeah.
I agree. I think
Jess, I want to go to you because we were talking about what governments can do what we can do to governments to make sure they're held accountable. Online people are also asking, what's the responsibility of journalists in this to take responsibility for their safety and where that responsibility lies. So we heard from a lot of freelance journalists who of course are oftentimes in the line of fire. Asad Beg tweeting us from the UK, he's worked in the CAR. He says he worked with no vest, no insurance, no satellite. He did everything from A to Z himself. worked alone. It was stupid. So on the other hand, we got this tweet from Stanley, who kind of pushes back against that tweet. He says, if one is contracted by a news bureau, then it's their responsibility to ensure they're properly trained and insured. So Jess, of course, you said that you had a gun, but is that something that you recommend for other journalists, that it's up to them to arm themselves?
Even freelancers?
Of course.
Well, that is not, however, prevalent in the Philippines, only in several parts of the country. But it is very important that journalist organizations must rise up as one in dealing with impunity. We have already cases of, for example, in the biggest Maguindanao massacre, the suspects were all taken in. They are now in jail and the trial is going on. But there is this feeling that the trial is endlessly ongoing. And so the journalists here, as one in the Philippines, raise their voices in seeing to it that the flow of justice is not slow, and that other cases where journalists were killed, there is support given to the parents and to the relatives so that they can stand. Because the pressure in seeking justice is not only in the courtrooms. It is a real problem of families who have to face day-to-day threats even after their relative has been gunned down. And so it is very important that there must be a support system coming from media organizations. And this is what many organizations in the Philippines now are doing.
Miroslava, I saw you were agreeing with him.
Yeah, I was agreeing and disagreeing in the same time, basically. I agree that families of those who are killed or threatened need support. I am in that place, and fighting for justice takes a lot of energy, a lot of resources, and a lot of courage. And we do need support, because in every crime there is has to be someone who really cares about the results or about the justice. And I mean, in majority of cases, it's families, wives, friends, or someone else, or some parents. So they need support. That I agree with, and I don't agree that it's a journalist's responsibility to protect themselves. Yes, we have to protect ourselves. We have to be careful, but in the same time, we just had a revolution in Ukraine, and the journalists were wearing vests and helmets and everything else, and they were targeted in their eyes. They were holding cameras and they were targeted in their eyes. The people who were, the army were shooting directly to the journalists just because they were targeting journalists. So it's not a question of protection. It has to be a judicial system. It has to be much more than just.
And Courtney, very quickly, you were going to jump in there. Just wrap it up very quickly for us.
I think that really highlights the fact that journalists are in much more precarious role than they used to be, because governments don't see them as necessary. Other non-state actors don't see them as necessary to get their story across.
Right. Yes.
The means of communication are in everyone's hands. And so journalists are in this more nebulous area, and that's leading to greater risks.
Certainly true. And Jess, of course, you pointed out that journalists and media organizations need to band together in order to try and solve this. Well, we have an encouraging tweet. For as much as we've perhaps criticized, or oftentimes the UN is criticized for its inaction, UNESCO tweeting just moments ago to AJ Stream, the UN is committed to bringing together the international community to end impunity, having a plan of action. So perhaps to end on a somewhat positive note.
I just hope it's not just a word.
I hope it's not just words, but
Let's see them hold states accountable.
Perhaps words is a start, and so is the conversation that we all just had. So thank you to all of our guests for joining us. I want to remind our viewers that Al Jazeera journalists Peter Gresta, Mohammed Fahmy, and Bahr Mohammed remain in an Egyptian prison, and after being falsely accused of aiding the outlawed Muslim Brotherhood. Al Jazeera has denied all charges and is demanding their release. You can follow the story and tweet your support using the hashtag #FreeAJStaff. On the next show, more than 20 million people may soon run out of water. We'll discuss how the Brazilian city of Sao Paulo has reached this level of shortage and what can be done to manage it. Until then, we'll see you online. Welcome to the Stream's online post show. We're continuing our discussion on what's being done to end impunity for crimes against journalists. Still with us, Miroslava Gongadze, journalist and activist, Courtney Raj, advocacy director with the Committee to Protect Journalists, and Jesus Dureza, chairman and president of the Philippines Press Institute. Thanks again to all our guests for joining us for the post show. Malika, I want to ask you, we kind of ended the conversation a little bit abruptly, but I know that the conversation online is certainly continuing.
Of course, there's lots more. And so I actually want to share this this comment we got on Facebook, Miroslava. This is from Tom Rizzo, and he writes in, there is a distinct absence of sanctions that can be enacted that would make any real difference. A blue-helmeted UN protection squad could work in some instances, but he says this is one of those problems that defy easy solutions. So of course, in today's show, we're trying to talk about what those solutions could look like. But to do that, some of it has to go back to what it is that journalists are working on and why they're such a threat to these governments. So what was it that your husband was working on? And do you think that that work will continue even though he's not here with us any longer?
I mean, he was uncovering corruption. He created the first Ukrainian internet newspaper and was talking about corruption in the country. And that was the threats for the authority, because he was speaking out, not internally, not inside of the country where everyone knew what's going on, but he was speaking outside of the country so everyone can see. And that was a danger. But I'm very happy that the colleagues that he worked with carry on his work. And now Ukrainska Pravda, Ukrainian Truth, the newspaper that he created, is one of the most influential internet newspaper in Ukraine.
And that's what sparked it all, right?
Yes.
Creating that newspaper
Yes.
and trying to pressure the president with the corruption charges.
Yeah.
To the point that Malika brought up, I'm curious. I mean, he must have known the risks
Yes,
that he faced. And knowing those risks, I'm curious from a character point of view. I mean, what was your husband like?
For him, doing what he was doing, discovering the truth, going, speaking out, was breathing. He would not stop. Yes, we received the threats, and he was told to leave the country. We discussed what to do. It was months before he was kidnapped and killed, and we realized that we don't have anywhere to go, and what would we do? This is our life, this is our job, this is what we are, who we are, and we didn't do anything about it.
We have this tweet from Samuel Anabaroni, Malika, echoing some of what you were referencing during the main show and what we discussed. It says, we understand that most attacks on journalists comes from the politicians from home countries and beyond, so that's a big problem. Courtney, I see you're nodding. When we look at this kind of conundrum that we were discussing in the main show, that if governments are allegedly involved in either the cover-up or the murdering of journalists, with a lack of an international body, much like the ICC, and it seems as though there's little action that will actually come from this day of impunity, if you will. I don't mean to kind of poo-poo it too much, but what do you see as kind of an encouraging sign, if there is one?
Well, I think the issue is that we have to change the calculus in which there is no political will to pursue the murderers of journalists. And so international pressure can help create the political will. So if governments and politicians feel that it is more costly to murder journalists, it is more costly not to investigate those crimes and bring their murderers to justice, then maybe we could see some resolution. And we address actually some very specific recommendations in the report that we launched today called The Road to Justice, breaking the cycle of impunity in the killing of journalists. And we have a whole series of recommendations. But I think, the UN also has to hold itself to a higher standard. And I mean, I don't know whether governments that are not responding to requests for information, who are having endemic levels of impunity, should be the ones who are co-sponsoring, resolutions on the safety of journalists, because I think you're right, it risks just being words. But I don't think that we can bring the normative pressure to bear without raising awareness, and this is a step in doing that.
Malika, do we have any last words from the community on this point?
Yeah, I'll share this tweet from Baligon, and he says something that I think sums up what a lot of journalists watching this and tweeting us probably feel. He says, isn't it enough that we endanger our lives to keep people informed? The most we ask is respect for the sanctity of our lives.
Most certainly, and it seems Miroslava at the least agrees with him. Good to have some agreement. Courtney, you're nodding as well. Always a nice way to top out the show. I want to thank all the guests again for joining us. Now on to the next show. More than 20 million people may soon run out of water. We'll discuss how the Brazilian city of Sao Paulo has reached this level of shortage and what can be done to manage it. Until then, we'll see you online.